Okay, part two. Hopefully the first part worked, and we'll try to finish this up in just one more video. Okay, this was one other treaty that was done during the Washington Disarmament Conference. It was known as the Five-Power Treaty. This was what referencing all of the nations agreeing to limit their naval power, and so this is how many, the battleship ratio that each would get. You can see all the details. Japan got a guarantee the U.S. and Britain would stop fortifying their eastern territories, including the Philippines and Guam. The loophole was there was no restrictions on small warships, so you could build those up. It was the big battleships that they were trying to restrict. Okay, so looking at the isolationism and the trend of being isolated, we're looking at the Great Depression shifting the focus to domestic affairs. Foreign policy really seemed kind of remote, unimportant. People were more focused on the Depression. When they did think of foreign policy, they were really disinterested because of the dangers of war. There's a lot of national resentment to economic hardship that had come after World War I. The rise of militaristic dictators in Italy in the 20s, Japan and Germany in the 30s, and we're going to go over each one of those because I know you have slots to write stuff down. Okay, so for this is what you write down for Germany. For Germany, you have the rise of Hitler. Adolf Hitler comes to power in 1933 as the head of the National Socialist or Nazi movement, Nazi Party. He blames the Jews a lot for the problems of Germany, promotes the Aryan or the master race, has basically a totalitarian dictatorship. He was the Fuhrer. He was reigning supreme. He took Germany out of the League of Nations, reoccupied the Rhineland, reunites Germany under the Third Reich, basically the equivalent of the fascist government in Italy. Okay, Nazi Germany, a lot of the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany was because of the economic hardships that had come out of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler would play on the anti-Semitic hatred, or the anti-Jewish sentiment, and gains the German legislature in 1933 with his army of quote-unquote brown shirts, and really takes over control little bit by little bit until you have the Nazi Party that we know now. In Italy, Benito Mussolini began the fascist party. Il Duce, the leader, he is going to come to power in 1922, embarks on a very aggressive foreign policy in 1935, inspired by the acts of Hitler and the going along with it. Fascism, by the way, if you're not really very well acquainted with it, is the idea that people should glorify their nation through acts of aggressive force. Really attracts a lot of dissatisfied war veterans, nationalists, those that were afraid of communism. Fascism and communism were technically ideological enemies. They did, basically clash with each other, and but still, the whole idea of having a totalitarian, dictator is going to be something that's going to be a theme throughout the 30s. All right, so looking at Italy, Mussolini is going to invade Ethiopia, who calls on the League of Nations for help, and that whole idea of collective security, or everyone working together to help protect each other, basically falls through for them. In Japan, the nationalists, the militarists, take over the government by the 1930s, mid-1930s. They also leave the League of Nations, so essentially League of Nations, not working out so well. They use fear and assassination and begin an invasion of China and Southeast Asia. They're going to convince the Japanese emperor this is the best way to ensure Japanese access to raw materials, oil, tin, iron, and so they're going to invade China, which is going to cause a lot of backlash in the Western world, particularly from the United States. Militarism in these countries is going to undermine the whole Versailles Agreement from World War I and threaten to destroy a balance of power. And in 1940, those three countries, Germany, Italy, and Japan, get together to sign an alliance and form the Axis powers and work together. All right, so the whole idea with neutrality, Americans are going to want neutrality. Americans nationalists wanted to ensure the U.S. is never drawn into war again. Most people are wanting peace and non-involvement. There is a lot of protests, more from the student, teacher, professor demographic in the United States. You do have a lot of people. Isolation is very, very strong among Midwestern Americans and also a lot of the Republican Party were anti-war. One of the examples or lead people that is talking about that is Senator Gerald Nye, leads the passage of neutrality with neutrality legislation, and basically starts to investigate from World War I munitions dealers, or what he called merchants of death. He blames the greed of bankers and arms dealers and manufacturers for the U.S. intervention for the first place in 1917, and basically blames the U.S. getting involved on the fact that people that could benefit from war wanted to fill their pocketbooks, and so it pushed us into war. U.S. trade with nations at war became prohibited. No arms to belligerent nations. U.S. loans to nations at war was prohibited as well. Never again philosophy. The different neutrality laws that you guys looked at in your homework. 1935, neutrality was to prohibit all arms and shipments. No travel on any belligerent ships or ships of nations at war. Also talked about the not giving arms to those of the different sides of the Spanish Civil War that broke out over fascism, who eventually wins and creates a dictatorship with Francisco Franco in Spain. 1936 neutrality said no loans or credit, and then the 1937 neutrality basically extends those same ideas on it. The whole neutrality of we're not going to loan anything, we're not going to give anything, we are just neutral. All trade other than munitions was on a cash and carry basis. So if you want to come to the United States and you want to buy it and take it with you, that's fine, but it can't be any war-related materials. 1937, Japan is going to invade China. FDR sees a big deal with this, sees a big threat to isolation, to our security, to protection of democracy, if you want to go that route. And so he's going to try to uphold neutrality, but will also push to be able to sell arms to China. It's kind of a retreat from the isolation just a little, and that also he starts to plant the idea of getting more involved in people's heads with things like his quarantine speech, where he basically says all the democratic nations of the world should get together and pledge to quarantine the aggressor nations of the world. So here's the attack on Manchuria, 1931. When Japan is invading, one of the things that they do is they accidentally sink a U.S. ship. And if you remember from the past, when someone sinks a U.S. ship, that usually leads to war. And so they immediately apologize, pay the U.S., promise no further attacks, and we accept the apology. We don't go to war with them at that time. Okay, so here's all the different things I just talked about with all the neutrality. Okay, so in Europe, as people are moving away from neutrality, U.S. is still trying to keep somewhat isolated, keep somewhat neutral. Several of the world leaders are trying to avoid another world war. And so one of the things is that most of what happens before is going to be basically a form of appeasement, or just letting the little things slide. Munich conference, and ever since then, Munich has basically become synonymous with appeasement. But they basically, the world leaders are going to meet. FDR, they meet with everyone in Munich and basically talks about trying to avoid war, and basically agree to let Hitler get away with small acts of aggression and expansion, hoping to avoid an all-out war. We have several different examples of those appeasements: Ethiopia, the Rhineland, China, Sudetenland. I'm going to go into each one of those. All of those were examples of basically appeasing Hitler. Hitler is going to seize Czechoslovakia after he promises, instead of just the Sudetenland, which is one of the things we're going to go over. And Germany's really going to show that they really have no limits. You can give them a little bit, but they're going to take it and run with it. And so you have a movement away from neutrality, away from the promises at all these conferences, and really this is when Germany's going to start taking it on their own and moving away. FDR is going to try to revise the Neutrality Acts to give aid to England, to France, wants to repeal the arms embargo, to place all trade with belligerents on a cash and carry nation or policy to favor England and France. Trying to basically, he feels the danger of the aggression as Germany basically tramples over everything that they gave him already. And September 1939, World War II will begin. Hitler will invade Poland after he'd already violated many of the examples we're going to talk about from the appeasement. England and France had said if he invades, we will go to war. So within 2 days, they declare war. Russia, surprising everybody, signs a Nazi-Soviet pact, a non-aggression treaty. Most people had figured that Russia would have been against Hitler because, like I said before, communism and fascism are ideological enemies. And so it really surprises them. Really in secret, Russia and Germany had agreed to divide Poland between them. And this is when we start to, Roosevelt's basically going to declare the acts, enforce these neutrality acts, and start to move towards being a little bit more involved. Okay, so here's a couple of the first ones. These are already written for you, so I'll just briefly go over them. But Mussolini is going to invade Ethiopia. We talked about that one, proving basically the strength of the fascist government that he has. League of Nations and the U.S. both object to this, but really don't take any action. The Rhineland, as you can see in the map, was a region in Western Germany that was supposed to be permanently demilitarized as of the Treaty of Versailles. But Hitler will openly defy it, and the treaty's terms show zero respect for it. In China, basically a full-scale war is going to break out between Japan and China. And this is when that ship sunk that I showed you before, the Panay, and Japan will apologize, we accept. The Sudetenland was probably one of the bigger pieces of appeasement that we gave to Hitler. Hitler insists that Germany has the right to take over this strip in Czechoslovakia. Most of them were German-speaking already. And so England and U.S. will meet with Hitler in Munich at that conference, and they agree to terms. And then that's when, after that, is when Hitler will violate that and invade everything. It's kind of the whole thing. It doesn't really work, that whole, if you give a mouse a cookie book, that whole idea. Not going to, that's basically what we're doing. We tried to give him a little bit, and instead he's just, it's just one little piece until he takes more, and that's when people realized, oh, he's not going to stop, so we had better do something against him. The U.S. Going towards war is remaining at peace, 1939 to 1941. We have a lot of sympathy for the Allies, a lot of distaste for Germany and Japan. Americans are alarmed at how much the Nazi Party is conquering country after country. And so Roosevelt openly favors allies, which is not isolationist. That's definitely showing a side or favoritism towards a side. And FDR is going to basically argue for neutrality, except also increasing security at the same time. Proposes an arms buildup. Congress will approve a two-thirds budget increase to start to build up our preparation towards war. Okay, so going from neutrality to undeclared war, this is what one of the things that FDR wanted to do was to help England without actually entering the war. He calls Congress to special session to revise the neutrality legislation, repeals the arms embargo, and goes to a cash and carry basis. Basically, nations at war can come and buy goods and take it with them. British Navy at this point was controlling the seas. So if we end our arms embargo, meaning we end the policy that says we can't sell to anybody, it's really going to mean we're only trading with England, because they're the only ones that have the ability to come and get supplies. Cash and carry policy is technically neutral, but definitely favors England. In 1940, Germany is going to occupy France, drives England off the continent. France was taken over, and we allow all-out aid to the Allies short of war. And we also are going to start in 1940 the Selective Service Act. Remember that from World War I? It's basically registering for a draft. We require all men 21 to 35 to register, and we're going to start moving towards war. Okay, this is into part 2. One more part left, almost done.